What it really takes is a family, and we as conservatives have to fight for the family.
A party that desires to lead this country must have an agenda that the American people believe helps them.
What is it that we can do to keep government from growing so large we can win this battle?
I'm Daniel Mccarthy, Vice President for the Collegiate Network at ISI. I'm also the editor of ISI's publication, Modern Age, a quarterly journal which was founded by Russell Kirk back in 1957, and since then has continued to be, I think, the premier outlet for intellectual conservatism, taking a sort of longer and more theoretical view of the American right than is typical of the news publications that you may see elsewhere. Well, unfortunately, Congressman Jim Banks was unable to join us this afternoon because he had a vote on Capitol Hill, but this has actually given us an opportunity to expand our programming, and we are honored and thrilled to present the panel that we're about to have right now. We have someone who needs very little introduction, Jeff Sessions, who has been Attorney General of the United States, a United States Senator, and a public service for a very long time and in many capacities. We also have William Ruger, who is the president of the American Institute for Economic Research, and who was very nearly U.S. ambassador to Afghanistan. He had been nominated, but unfortunately the Senate did not take up his nomination before the end of the last administration. Our discussion today will talk about economics. It'll talk about some of the experiences that both of these distinguished panelists have had in their careers, and we'll also talk about some of the philosophical common ground and differences between conservatives and libertarians. So I thought first I would turn to Jeff Sessions and ask you about your experiences in government as someone who has had to deal with trade policy, with immigration policy, so many other facets of the American economy. And how have you seen, sort of changes on the American right over that time? How have your own views on economics evolved or developed over that period?
It's really an exciting change, I think, wisely and correctly. Maybe it was correct, the views we were advocating for, I was advocating for when I came to the Senate in '96, were good for that time. But I do think we've changed a lot. And first I'd like to say I didn't expect to be on a panel, didn't plan to be here, except I thought the conference was really good. You had some really fine people talking about a critical issue for the Republic. What we as conservatives who are beginning to accumulate a working majority, what can we do to accumulate that majority, to govern and to make America a better place? So I'm proud to share some thoughts on it. And my transition or all change probably is pretty synonymous with what happened in the country, although I guess in the Senate I was pretty early in being an advocate for some change in our policy. So I came and still believe very strongly that market forces are critical to any nation that desires to prosper. It has an integrity about it that is essential, and it makes decisions that government has no ability to make, should not be attempting to make, and would only be made corruptly. And I'd rather have market forces make those decisions than the government, that's for sure. I guess where I began to confront some of the issues, we got a collapse of the textile industry in the South. Yet I voted for WTO for China. I was uneasy about it, but I did it. I bought into this idea that they were going to moderate and we're going to be better and the world's going to be happy. But I never was an ideological believer in free trade and markets, that peace would break out, we'd cure cancer, and the world would progress happily ever after, and history would be rewritten. I think that's an ideological view, and I'm an opponent of ideology. I believe in living in reality. So as time went by, I began to understand that we were tilting too much toward big business, that we were not listening to the American worker, that tax cuts for global corporations wasn't going to win elections in the heartland of America, and that the average American was not happy. I remember being at a retreat that McConnell called at the Library of Congress to work out our economic plan. This was 2014, 15, and the great Rob Portman, who's so talented, was heading the team, and they came up with a plan, and I raised my hand, and I said, there's something missing here. So what is it? I said, well, nowhere do you say you want wages for working people to go up. You know, when I came to the Senate, it was pretty much, you read the Wall Street Journal, and if wages went up, that was bad, you know? Wages are rising. Cost, whatever. Business is going to have to pay more. This isn't good. But the vast majority of the American people are wage earners. And they'd like a pay raise. And they'd like to share in wealth of this country better than they've been sharing in recently. And so I don't know how. I don't have the full answers to how. I would just say to you, that's the reality. And a party that's going to win an election needs to appeal to the voters, right? So Trump did. They thought he had the guts to take on the establishment. And he was promoting an agenda that I liked. That's why I was the first senator to endorse it. He was talking about defending American interest. The era of the nation state is not over, in my opinion. Elected officials have a duty to protect their people, the interest of the people they serve, and you cannot depend on global corporations to defend the interests of the American working people. Surely you realists know they want lower wages. Why do you think Silicon Valley wants to import all these workers? Out of some ideological vision of peace in the world? It's because you flood the market with foreign high-tech workers and wages don't go up. And in fact, wages, when I was in the Senate, hadn't gone up for high-tech workers in years. So that was one of the reasons why. So I would just say there are a lot of things out there that can work together for the benefit of the average American. A party that desires to lead this country must have an agenda that the American people believe helps them. And I am telling you, when I came, I will acknowledge, we thought the Wall Street Journal and the big corporations always knew what they were talking about, and the Republicans tried to help them make more money so they'd hire more people, and we thought that was the way to do all this. But you can't trust those people. Their interest is not coterminous with the interest of the average American worker. Their interest is maximizing their profits. Give me a break. Does anybody deny that? I mean, that's the way the system is set up. They are there to maximize product. So you want to listen to them about how the world works, what's happening to them, how we can help American corporations be healthy and not be stupid and all of that, and undermine what they're doing. But if you think that they're proposing proposals to Congress to make the life of a worker in Ohio better, it's not true. So the only people that are defending the American worker who has no lobbyist, no PACs, no power, can't go into the congressman's office, is the elected official, right? I mean, who else? What power? What do they have? So I've learned to be a little more realistic about power, and so what the American people said, we're not getting charged up, we're going to go up with Trump. And he going to defend us. And he did. A lot of people, I worried whether we would follow through on all the promises he made. He did, and he was effective in helping the economy be stronger and more vital. And we, for the first time, had minorities' wages increasing faster than inflation, and we had a real nice thing. 20 years, wages increased less. So that's kind of my transition, and I do. Maybe we can talk about the national security aspect of adhering to the lowest price in all our purchases. That may not be sustainable.
Yeah, I think we'll come around to that. So Senator Sessions has talked about how the right has changed, how America's view of things like the World Trade Organization and the relationship between workers, big business, and government has developed over the recent years. And these have been hard lessons learned. And you've seen a great many changes, many of which have been displayed so far at this conference, and more of which will be on display tomorrow, as conservative thinking perhaps drifts away from what had been considered a Reaganite orthodoxy or a fusionist orthodoxy, and perhaps you're seeing the emergence of a new right. Will Ruger has given this a great deal of thought. I think it's fair to say that Will identifies as a libertarian, but he is a virtue libertarian, and he's someone who has always worked very closely with conservatives. And so, Will, I'd like to ask you, what is the future of fusionism in this new political environment that Senator Sessions has described and that we've all had experience with?
Yeah. I mean, I guess I'd first say that I like classical liberal better, but that's maybe a tyranny of small differences, or maybe because of the libertarian brand has not been evolving as I'd like. It needs to have more, I think, appreciation for virtue and personal responsibility and so forth. But again, I think we can sometimes make a lot of the differences, and those are important. And I think the future of conservatism, we need to battle it out about kind of where we're going to head and what we believe in. From even some shared first principles. So I want to talk about some agreements first, actually, which is, as the senator said, there's a general agreement, I think, whether libertarian, classical, liberal, conservative, that the free enterprise system is the best way for economic growth. And that includes not just for the elites, but also for everyone else, the people who don't have access to the congressman's and congresswoman's office, right? Free enterprise is helpful. Particularly you think about how small businesses are some of the, kind of the backbone of our economy, and, people who may not have the same political power as Google, but are providing, good living for their family and so forth. And they value free enterprise because in a non-free enterprise system, it's the well-connected and the elite that benefit oftentimes the most. The other thing is, I think when it comes to some of the challenges of trade, I think that serious libertarians, classical liberals, conservatives agree on the fact that we have to be careful about tech theft abroad. I think we have to be careful about IP protection. And again, there are some libertarians who have a principled case against intellectual property. It's not one that I think every libertarian shares. But I think IP is something we have to be concerned about. There are excesses on the other side, of course. And then the national security exception. I mean, my colleague at AIER, Sam Gregg, talked about this, that, even Adam Smith didn't think it was, that free trade was a suicide pact when it came to national security. So I think we agree on that. Now, what are the contours of that? How do we define dual-use technologies, things like that? That's always going to be the devil in the details. But I think there's agreement there. But there are differences, Dan, and these are things we're going to have to unravel and really dig into. And I think some aspects of this will be philosophical or even ideological, like the senator talked about, but some are going to have to be empirical. And one of the things, and I know that you don't oftentimes hear me talk well of neoconservatives, but one of the things that I think we should admire about early neoconservatives was the social science aspect of neoconservatism and wanting to look at the empirics. A lot of the early neocons were opposed to Great Society because they looked at the ravages it had and investigated this empirically, right? When it comes to poverty policy, for example, right? Again, don't tell Bill Kristol I said good things about neocons. He won't believe you. But I think we have to look at these. So, for example, when it comes to national industrial policy, what are the effects of that? Especially in terms of breeding cronyism and corruption. And I think one difference is that some national conservatives maybe see that as the price of doing business, or they're not as worried about it. Whereas I think classical liberals, libertarians look at that as the breeding grounds of corruption and cronyism. So that's maybe one difference. Another is the issue of just kind of how much Americans benefit from free trade. And again, I think that there's more nuance than difference here, because again, there is a commitment to free enterprise. But the issue of free trade, I think, is one where Americans do benefit quite a bit. The question is the distribution of benefits, right? And that's an important issue. Another thing is the question of trade and peace. There are some libertarians who believe that trade is peace-inducing in the world. There are other, conservatives generally are skeptical of that. I myself am skeptical of it, mostly because I hearken from realism as a guide to my foreign policy, as opposed to a kind of ideological foundation. But that is a difference. Another one is maybe the necessity and utility of antitrust policy. And there's some good research by economists like George Stigler and others showing that some of the problems with antitrust. But again, this is a difference, and especially with those who kind of hearken back to one of my least favorite presidents, actually, Teddy Roosevelt. There are conservatives who like Teddy Roosevelt. They like some of that aspect. That's not my my issue there. And my arguments against Teddy Roosevelt would probably be too long for this panel. But a last thing would probably be the issue of to what extent we need a certain moral ecology for a free enterprise, free market system to work. Now, Dan referenced virtue libertarianism. I think I saw Stephanie Slade from Reason Magazine in the audience. There are libertarians or classical liberals like us who do believe that there are certain kind of, I think, moral foundations that make market economies work better, make societies a better society, and allow us to flourish. And Stephanie, I'm sorry if I misspoke for you, but I've appreciated your work on fusionism. But then there are some libertarians who make less of that, right? Or minimize the requirements of that. And there are some conservatives who think it needs to be thicker than maybe even a virtue libertarian like myself or others. So I think those are some of the kind of fault lines in the debate, especially when it comes to economics.
Let me bring this back to the difficult question of national security and economics. So, Edmund Burke, as we heard on the first panel, was very concerned about Britain's trade relations at a time when Britain was at war with revolutionary France. That revolutionary France was trying to export an ideology which in fact was destructive of all the regimes in Europe that it was able to touch, and which would have overthrown the British regime as well if the British had not strongly resisted what revolutionary France was doing. Today, we have a very close relationship between the United States and the People's Republic of China. And this raises a number of concerns, maybe not exactly identical to those that Edmund Burke was facing at his time, but nevertheless, the People's Republic of China, of course, is a communist state, and yet it is in such a close relationship with us that we have difficulty setting our own policies without taking account of the enormous amount of goods that we get from China, the enormous amount of our national debt that China owns. There's really, a tremendous fault line here. So I wanted to ask Senator Sessions about your thoughts on China and America's relationship with China and the national security dimension of economics. How is your thought sort of developed on those points?
I think that the relationship with China is very, very, very serious. This is a nation of 1 billion people that is highly accomplished, resolutely driven to be the premier nation in the world, to take their rightful place there. They have a state policy of advancing industries that they believe are essential for the future, whether it's space and missiles, whether it's electric vehicles, whether it's chips, whatever it is, they want to be number one in medical too, and they steal our medical records. They don't have to do surveys, they can just get our medical records off the internet. They do and what I want you to know, and what I learned in reading William Buckley as a teenager, Chinese communists that run that country are godless communist. They lie. Truth is not important to them. They control their people with lies and oppression, and they should never run the world. And the Western glory of our civilization is threatened by the communist agenda. And they have, instead of moderating like I thought they might when I voted for WTO back when, and I was willing to eat the losing our textile industry and those kind of things, we've now had the experience to feel differently. So I'm really worried about the threat from China. They are very serious about it. I do believe we have greater strengths than sometimes we realize. And I think we can hold our own. But I would say one more thing, and that is, I remember when Senator John McCain argued that the Defense Department was correct and attacked members of the Senate who said we shouldn't buy berets from China to put on our military people. It was sort of symbolic to me, like, okay, do they do our rifles? What about our canteens? When does this stop? They get to do our missiles for us? They're cheaper. So we're going to, let's say after they've obtained all Boeing's and Airbus's aircraft wing capacity characteristics, what if they can produce major aircrafts at 15% below? And Delta says, we owe our stockholders, we got to buy the cheapest airplane. Can America sustain a collapse of its aircraft industry? If they can defeat us on a lot of low-wage items, what about automobiles? What if they got cheaper and they could produce any automobile 15% cheaper than we could produce here? What if the Chinese government subsidizes their manufacturers for the specific purpose of closing General Motors and taking that market share? So I would say to my libertarian and free market friends, we don't live in a free market world. They're not free traders. None of them are, especially Asians. Europeans are pretty free trade, a lot of them, but not as much as we. And so so we can't sit here and watch our businesses and our technology be eroded because of state manipulation. I asked a guy one time at one of our hearings, what if this country will buy nothing from us, and should we buy from them? What did he say, Bill? He said, we buy from them. It's cheaper, buy it from them. But you do have, somebody needs to represent the people of the United States, our manufacturing industry, and maintain the health and national security. And we've got to have a chip manufacturer, and we've got to lead the world in computers and missiles and technology, and we can do that. But we're going to have to wake up because they are determined to take it over and are making progress toward that end.
Now, I know Will is itching to respond to several of those points, but I want to draw out one point in particular, which is, over the last 30 years, Americans across the political spectrum had a lot of optimism that if we engaged with China economically, we would see a moderation in China.
I believe that.
And unfortunately, it hasn't happened. No. And instead, under Xi Jinping, but even before Xi Jinping, it was clear that the Chinese communist system was not going the way of the Soviet Union, or at least not on the timeline that people had expected. Since the attempt to have peace and liberty through trade has failed, what is the best approach now to dealing with a very powerful state, both economically and militarily, certainly as a regional power, which has a system that is so alien to our own and that is very hair-raising for our allies in the region? What kind of hopeful future could we possibly have with a regime like China? What approach should we take if the approach of trade has failed?
Well, I think You're right that the modernization thesis that you talked about has been impugned by recent history, and I think we have to accept that. I think I'm a political scientist, so it doesn't surprise me that much that politics has primacy over economics when it comes to political economic outcomes, right? So I don't think that's odd. But I guess I'm a little bit more optimistic about the American economy and our ability to challenge and compete with China and every other country in the world if we embrace markets, and not just markets in terms of international free trade, but I think really making sure that we don't commit the sin of essentially bridling the power of free markets here at home. And I do worry about that, and I worry about conservative faith in free markets. I think that we need to redouble our faith in free markets because some of the things that are holding us back, many of the things that are holding us back in our competition with other countries, including China, is actually problems here at home caused by government. And I'm not that old, but I remember when conservatives hated government. Even if they didn't agree with Grover Norquist that you want it so small you can strangle it in a bathtub, they still really believed in the power of markets. And I think we have to do that. And one of the things I worry about are conservatives who aren't seeing markets as part of the answer, particularly to international competition. We need to be getting rid of regulations on our industries, right? Again, I'm not against all regulations, especially when it comes to significant direct externalities that are harmful to us and our people. But I do think we need to get rid of the things, especially that are caused by cronyism and the elites being connected to government in ways where those that are connected are able to essentially put bridles on competition. Right? We need to be pro-competition. I also remember as a kid, the 1970s when American cars were just not very good at competing with the Japanese. And part of the problem was because of our political economy here at home. It wasn't just that the Japanese were competing with us, it's that we were having problems here at home, in Michigan and other places. And so we need to unleash, I think, the power of markets while being obviously concerned about some of the things that the senator was talking about, that are dual-use technologies, right? The ability to make sophisticated aircraft has national security implications and commercial implications, and we need to have that at home for that reason. So again, I don't think you have to be naive about markets or about international relations to not appreciate the fact that we should be doubling down on confidence in freedom and free markets. And I think it would be terrible if freedom becomes a bad word both on the right and the left. And I'm gonna trust in what the senator said earlier, that even people who have some concerns about kind of ideological free marketeerism will still not throw the baby out with the bathwater. Now, when it comes to China in particular, one reason why I have faith in free markets is because of the economics of basic economics, right? Of the law of comparative advantage and so forth. But also because of the effects of competition in terms of making you, I think, leaner and meaner. Competition is good, right? If you run in your own lane in a track race, running is hard. If you have to run against somebody else, you got to suffer the pain and run harder and run smarter. So I think we have to embrace that. But one of the reasons I'm confident about our ability to compete with China and to be safe, right? Because ultimately national security is about safety. It's not about international peace. It's about our security here at home. That's the primary role of government, is to protect our security, not altruism in Libya or Ukraine or something like that, right? It's us. One of the reasons I'm confident is because some of the aspects of the international system that I think the hawks, well, I don't even like the word hawks because I think I'm a hawk. I believe in a strong national defense. But the neocons, the liberal internationalists, right, is that they don't have faith in things like the fact that we have the strongest military in the world, the best Navy, the best Air Force, second best Air Force in the Navy's Air Force. We have a strong space capability. Also, China has lots of problems in its neighborhood. We don't. We have weak neighbors who aren't very populous and are friendly to us and have an interest in bandwagoning with us. We also have nuclear weapons, and the nuclear revolution is underrated, right? Like, what's going to happen if the Chinese try to do the million-man swim? Right? What's going to happen there? Okay? The Chinese armada, we could use our nuclear weapons to both deter, and if they start coming across the ocean, it's kind kind of hard to imagine something like that, right? Because we have such a great deterrent and defense force. So I don't think the bite of China is as hard in politics and security as much as it is in economics, where the question of competition, particularly if they're engaging in tech theft, espionage, like IP issues, we do have to be concerned about that. But I think we can compete with free markets, and we should pursue realism and restraint in our grand strategy, and we shouldn't overreact such that we're ultimately, say, sending our men and women, our young men and women, to fight in foolish wars like we've done for the last 30 years.
So Will is a naval reservist, and I'm surprised to hear him say that the U.S. Navy has only the second best Air Force, as opposed to having an even better Air Force than the U.S. Air Force itself. Will has brought up foreign policy, and since we have two people who are outstanding in their foreign policy thought, perhaps we should shift gears and talk a little bit about that. I know, Senator Sessions, that you face some very hard choices in the U.S. Senate, regarding our foreign policy on Iraq and so many other issues. Tell us a little bit about how your thinking has changed over the years and kind of what conflicts you think the United States needs to be thinking about right now.
Very well. I'll do my best on that. I would say that I support the idea that we need to place the least virtual libertarian on American industry and protecting, allowing them to be productive at the highest level. And we do that better than most countries, I think, although there's some contend otherwise. I don't think so. I think we're better than Europeans. And so I want to keep that. However, that doesn't answer the question about what if our competitor subsidizes a specific industry and our industry cannot compete against a subsidized import. Number one. So that's just an economic thing. Say it's not a critical national security. And then throw on top of that, this technology is critical to our national security in addition. And so one of the big things that has changed, and you'll hear from Bob Lighthizer, I think later in the conference, I have a great respect for him. He, like George Washington and Alexander Hamilton, believed in tariffs, right? Southerners, Madison and Jefferson didn't. Who won? Hamilton and Washington, and they built an industrial base here quicker than would have happened if we hadn't had the tariff. You can argue it one way or the other, but this country was not founded on total free trade. That is not true. In Mobile, Alabama, the biggest building was the customs house where they collected the tariffs, and the same in New York City. If you could be the director of customs in New York City, you were the richest man in the city. So anyway, I'm just saying that. On foreign policy, I think I'm kind of become a George Kennan person. Somebody at Johns Hopkins wrote a piece recently. He holds the Kissinger chair. But he wrote a piece that with regard to China, we need to develop a containment policy, a serious analysis and recognition that we face a formidable opponent in China and that we need to take a series of steps to protect our interest against this nation who has a state-run policy. They keep wages low, but their economy is almost as big as ours, and they got more people. So Japan and all their automobiles, they ran out of people to make them, really, and they built them in Alabama. We got Honda, and we got Toyota, and we got Hyundai, Korean, and Mercedes-Benz. We're like number 4 in the country, all foreign investment in Alabama, so I'm really happy about it. And I believe in that, but I'm just saying to you, I could see China really dominating the world's economy. automobile market. So on our foreign policy. So I think a serious strategy needs to be undertaken. I call one well-known foreign policy expert who held high office recently to discuss it. Maybe a conference, I mentioned, maybe we could have a conference among conservatives on what we should do to protect the security interest of our country against whatever threats, but obviously the greatest right now is China. And Russia is, in my view about Russia, somehow, some way, this should never have happened. I don't know how, but in the last 25 years, this issue of the Ukraine and other has been out there, and somehow our diplomats should have dealt with it, and somehow this not have happened. Hillary tried to have a reset, and that didn't work. By the time that administration was over, Putin hated them. Trump tried, and it didn't work. So I don't say it's easy. It was complicated by the Russian hoax. That was part of it. But somehow Russians are a Christian nation. They're not a communist nation, ostensibly a Christian nation. And culturally, and they're part of Europe. They've always really wanted to be European. Now it would be a disaster if they drifted to China. It's almost unthinkable that this global event would have happened. That somehow, next thing you know, it's China and Russia against the United States and the West. That would be geopolitically. So I don't know how we could have done that, but I think we need a realism in our policy, and I do believe that some sort of long-term plan to hold the surge of China, and maybe this spasm of emotional nationalism will begin to settle, and maybe their failure to provide individual liberty somewhere will begin to erode their confidence as a nation. I don't know, but it may be 5 decades like it was before, it may be longer.
Yeah, I mean, on the issue of tariffs, I mean, one big difference, of course, is that tariffs was revenue raising for them. That's how they were funding the government. And today we have too many taxes. And so one of the challenges or worries that I have about tariff policy, particularly when it's on specific aspects of our economy as opposed to a general rate, is that it is really rife for corruption and cronyism, where you're seeing essentially collusion against the public interest, right? There are more steel users than steel producers. And so there are ramifications from, I think, some of these tariff policies that you see being promoted as much by K Street as by Main Street. So that's, I think, one thing there. On the issue of Johns Hopkins, I mean, a lot of the folks at Johns Hopkins, in their, among their strategists, they've been almost wrong about everything for 20 to 30 years. So I love the reference to Kennan, because Kennan was smart. And I think what Kennan would do is look at the nature of the balance of power, right? That's what a good realist does. And I think he would be worried today, unlike in the 1940s, he would be worried today more about threat inflation than not stepping up enough. And I think the 1940s, it was a very different world, right? The threat of the Soviet Union was actually, I believe, greater than the threat of China to us today, partly because of the nature of the world and the nature of the balance of power. It's not to say that China isn't a problem. It is our number one strategic adversary and competitor. It needs to be more of a focus of our foreign policy than Europe or the Middle East. We should be getting the hell out of the Middle East, right? If we're going to defend, oil flowing to China, well, look, let them have to pay some of the cost of that. Europe, look, Russia, we should not have been pushing Russia further in bed with China if we're mostly concerned about China. We want them to naturally balance against China. They're, big powers next to each other usually don't bandwagon. They balance. It's artificial what you're seeing. So we need to find a way out of this conflict. We need to find a way towards peace in the Ukraine. But look, one of the things that has been proven, and I was saying this before the war, is that Russia was not as powerful as people were thinking. And that's only been shown by the war, right? I mean, their wheels are falling off, their inability to defeat a much smaller country like Ukraine, right next door, right? Their logistics are terrible. The fact is that the United States and our Western European allies are so much more powerful and strong than Russia. I mean, Russia only spends about $65 billion a year on defense. The United States spends more than 10 times that. And then if you add our allies, even if they don't spend it very well overseas, it's massive in terms of the power differential. You know, they have the economy the size of basically Spain. So I just worry a lot less about Russia. Now, if I'm a Ukrainian, sure, I worry about Russia, but I'm America firster, right? I think we should be fighting for America's national interests only, and we should be making sure that we're harnessing our strength for our biggest challenges, which I agree is China. And so I think but we have to be careful about threat inflation. And I'm not saying that the senator is doing that at all. I hear him praise realism. But we have to remember that China has a lot of problems. It has still relatively powerful states on its periphery: Japan, Vietnam, the Philippines, Indonesia, India, South Korea. These are countries that will have a natural desire to balance against China. You know, China, even though it has the economy the size of the United States, they have 4 times the population. So their GDP is 1/4 ours per capita. And they also have a population challenge, a graying population. And I think among conservatives here, right, conservatives are pro-family. They recognize the value of families. They tend to be, for the most part, opposed to abortion, and they've seen what China has done, not only the moral horror of its policies in terms of the one-child policy, but the geopolitical ramifications of that, which is a graying population. So I think, yes, again, foreign policy is oftentimes more nuanced than slogans, and I love the slogan of ending our endless wars. I helped promote it. But we have to, I think there's an importance to have nuance here, particularly about China. Our most important strategic competitor, but they have some challenges, and we should try to deal with that responsibly and with realism, and worrying about the frames, I think, from the Cold War that might be less applicable.
So we will be talking more about foreign policy tomorrow afternoon. In the meantime, this evening, we're going to hear from Robert Lighthizer, and we'll be talking more about trade policy and economics. I want to thank Will Ruger and Jeff Sessions for joining us this afternoon, and I want to thank you all for being here.
Will,